North by Northwest was made a year or so after Vertigo in 1959. And we've actually not commented on how incredibly prolific Hitchcock is, but he on average made one film per year. And given the brilliance of these films, the rate I think is all the more incredible. Check out this decade here, only some of the films of which we've watched. So we have 1950s Stage Fright, then we have Strangers on a Train, I Confess, which is really great. The bottom left image there from I Confess. Dial M for Murder, actually, which Hitchcock made in 3D, which is apparently really good, but hard to access now, of course. That's in the top left hand corner there. Then Rear Window in 1954, To Catch a Thief, 1955, Trouble with Harry, 1955, a black comedy. That's the top right hand corner there. Then The Man Who Knew Too Much, that one is with Jimmy Stewart. The Wrong Man, which is a favorite film among the French film critics. That was in 1956, and that's the bottom right-hand corner there, starring the great Henry Fonda. Then we have Vertigo, and then North by Northwest, and then rounding out the decade with Psycho in 1960. So really just an incredible number of films, but also all of these films are really fantastic. I mean, they're the ones that everyone kind of thinks are the most critically acclaimed ones, like Strangers on a Train, Rear Window, the Vertigo, North by Northwest, and Psycho. But all of them really have so much to offer. So, but on to North by Northwest. So, North by Northwest stars the wonderful Cary Grant, whom some of you have seen before in perhaps Notorious, if you caught up with that one, or perhaps some other non Hitchcock films. He is, of course, one of the most iconic actors in Hollywood. He is a star who had charisma as well as acting chops, and we will get to see how great he is at both comedy and drama in this film. And this would actually be his fourth and last film with Hitchcock. The film also stars the wonderful Eva Marie Saint, another, you guessed it, blonde actress. Sadly, this was the only Hitchcock film that she was in, but she is really excellent in the film. And that dress you see her wearing there, by the way, is one that she absolutely loved wearing, just as a person and as an actress. This would be Hitchcock's first time working with the MGM studio, which did try to force some control over him. There were some scenes that the studio didn't like and wanted him to take out. But fortunately, both for him and for us, his contract with the studio stipulated that he have full artistic control over his films with the studio. So he essentially just politely and firmly refused all of their suggestions, and he ultimately maintained control. This film is also known for some trick shots and some settings. There are a number of these, what Truffaut calls trick shots in the film, meaning that Hitchcock used some special effects and some miniatures. So see if you can spot where those are. For example, sometimes a matte painting will be used instead of a real life background. Hitchcock also frequently features major American monuments or buildings in his films. It's kind of a rather wonderfully irreverent and cheeky move on his part. We saw some of that in Strangers on a Train, where you have this image of the Senate building behind Guy right as Bruno is sort of drawing him into his kind of dark plot. So there's this ironic contrast between the law and majesty and dignity of the Senate building and then what is happening to Guy, who is himself planning on going into politics. So Hitchcock often will use these iconic buildings to sort of underscore the irony or to sort of hint that there is a darkness in the world that cannot be contained by these structures. This film is famous for the way that it features the national monument Mount Rushmore, and it also features the United Nations building, which Hitchcock surreptitiously filmed from the outside, even though he was not supposed to. And he also ended up getting photos of the inside of the UN building too. So he went in under the guise of a regular visitor, and then he snapped a bunch of photos with his photographer so that he could. His aim was to rebuild and exactly replicate the inside of the UN building on the studio lot. He was a stickler for getting things right, as we have seen from the Truffaut interviews. So he wanted his UN set to look like the actual UN. There is also one really beautiful scene which is shot in a ponderosa pine forest in the second half of the film, and Hitchcock actually had 100 trees shipped into the MGM studio rather than going on location. So it's kind of movie magic, but he has real trees, but it's a set. There is also this famous sequence in the film in this wide open flat landscape and a cornfield. And as you watch, think about the way that Hitchcock films and frames the action and uses both sound and silence and music, or the lack thereof, to develop the tension and in order to make us feel the impact of the action. It's a really, really fabulous scene. It is actually a scene, though, that some might complain as implausible, as Hitchcock and Truffaut discussed in their discussion of the 39 Steps. And it's a scene that, when you look at it from a purely rational point of view, it doesn't make much literal sense, but it's a scene that highlights why the purely plausible doesn't always matter. And it highlights how Hitchcock is able to involve us so deeply in a story and characters and suspense that we really don't care about plausibility. Bottom line, the scene in the cornfield is stunningly shot and paced, and it's full of what Hitchcock calls pure cinema. It's really one of my all-time favorite sequences in Hitchcock films. The title designs here and the music. So, like Vertigo, the title designs are done by Saul Bass, and they really beautifully mirror the film's themes. And the music is again by the brilliant Bernard Herrmann, whom we will hear from again. One more time in Psycho, although he was a consultant on the sound for The Birds, even though The Birds has no music in it. Um, the film is maybe in some ways opposite in tone from something like Vertigo. Donald Spoto calls it a comic thriller, and it does have a very close relationship in many ways to the 39 Steps, both in terms of the light action and the story and the character. However, especially when we get to the second half, you'll see that it also has a lot in common with the darker themes of other Hitchcock films, and it is about a lot of things rather than just being a fun romp. In the same way that 39 Steps was about many things as well, even though it was also quite fun. Spoto rightly notes that North by Northwest is a film that, quote, leaves the gravest concerns or leavens the gravest concerns with spiky and mature wit. There is in the film quite a sharp political critique. Spoto notes, never has the hierarchy of unprincipled political expediency been so ruthlessly dissected and mercifully in a comedy. So there is a really strong political critique of the film and kind of political corruption that I think is quite interesting. North by Northwest too, even if its lightness and its wit is also a character study, much more so than the 39 Steps, and it invites us to consider the evolution of the main character. Would really he describes the evolution of the character really brilliantly in the piece that you'll read from him, and I'll also talk about that in my post viewing lecture. So, watch what happens to our main character over the course of the film. He begins as a confident, brash, twice divorced, rather shallow man who seems to have it all together. And then the rug is pulled out from under him. And ultimately, I think he is transformed in a way that Hannay in the 39 Steps never really was. We can also consider this film as an examination of a relationship. It has some parallels to Hannay and Pamela in the 39 Steps, as well as and it also examines those themes of trust and betrayal in really interesting ways. Some other themes and motifs in the film, you'll notice there's a journeying motif, very similar to the 39 Steps. There's an actual journey and also a character journey. And the literal journey goes, geographically speaking, north by northwest, hence the title of the film. There's a spy theme as well, like the 39 Steps, and that ties into themes of identity and loss of identity, as well as into the theme of performance and role playing and theatricality, which we also saw, of course, in the 39 Steps. So watch for overt references to performance and to theater and to roles and people playing roles and acting a part. You'll also see the most classic and wonderful sort of wrong man theme. There is also quite a delightful MacGuffin in this film too. Hitchcock, in fact, he referenced this film when he's explaining what a MacGuffin is, and he called the MacGuffin in North by Northwest his best MacGuffin because it was the emptiest. Oh, and also, watch for a pretty darn explicit visual sexual metaphor in the very last shot. Here we see Hitchcock really at his cheekiest at getting by the censors by alluding to sex without really showing it.